Good morning, everybody, and welcome. This is the online forum being hosted by Housing for the Aged Action Group and the Older Women's Network. We are discussing policy solutions and action to address the crisis in older women's housing. Today, we're going to hear from a great lineup of independent candidates for this federal election. So thanks so much for tuning in. Structural and systemic gender equality, a lack of investment in appropriate and affordable housing are responsible for this acute problem, where an estimated 405,000 women over the age of 45 are in danger of being homeless. It's worth noting that this number is based on the data from before the pandemic, so 2 years ago at least, and given the gendered economic impacts of the pandemic, it's safe to think there are even more older women at risk today. The scale of this issue is staggering. It is also pretty distressing. Older women are the fastest growing cohort of experiencing homelessness in Australia. We do have a good understanding of what's causing the problems, and there are lots of great solutions out there. So why are we not hearing more about this in this election campaign? The cost of housing is a huge factor in the stresses and pressures that so many of us feel. For 30% of us who rent, as well as those holding mortgages, housing is a massive contribution to the cost of living, and it's central to our well-being, especially as we age. Today, we want to shift the agenda. At a time when money and promises are being dished out with enthusiasm as part of this federal election campaign, we want to compel our political leaders to act to achieve meaningful, substantive, positive change in housing outcomes for older women. I would like to acknowledge that we have representatives from different levels of governments joining us today, as well as members of our community and older women who are at risk of homelessness from all parts of the country. It's great to have you joining us today. I'm also really pleased and honoured to call on Auntie Georgina Nicholson to do the Welcome to Country for us. Auntie Georgina is a Wurundjeri elder here in Melbourne and representative of the Wurundjeri Tribal Council. Welcome, Auntie Georgina.
Thank you, Karen. Wow, this is huge, isn't it? Hello, everyone. My name is Georgina Nicholson, and I am a proud Wurundjeri Woiwurrung woman. Wurundjeri being part of the Kulin Nation. The Kulin Nation consists of 5 clans, I believe, and they are Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung, Wathaurong, Tanarong, and Dja Wurrung. Wurundjeri being all of Melbourne CBD and surrounding country, extending north to the Great Divide, east to Mount Bawball, south to Mordialloc Creek, and west to the mouth of Werribee River. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to our ancestors who walked and lived on this land as free spirits for a very, very, very long time. I would also like to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be online with us today, and I pay my respects to you all and to your elders. I would also like to acknowledge all of the political candidates and everyone who has joined online today for this crucial conversation from all over Australia. Okay, so I would also like to acknowledge all of the landowners on where you are coming in from today, and I pay my respects to all those Aboriginal people and their elders. So Wominjeka, Wurundjeri, Balak, Yim and Kundivik. I'd just like to tell you what I've said in our Woiwurrung language, and that is welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. So, yeah, I might start with my mum in the welcome. So my mother, Martha Margaret Nicholson, maiden name Terrick, was delivered by her grandmother, Granny Jemima, and that was on Corranderk Aboriginal Mission near the present-day town of Healesville. So Granny Jemima was already teaching Mummy the importance of connection to country and caring for one another. Yeah, that's pretty amazing how that happened. So the tree that my mother was born under on Corranderk Mission is still standing. So that's pretty amazing. So my mother met a deadly Irish man that was in the early 1930s. And in 1937, Mummy and Daddy were married and they had 16 children, 8 girls, 8 boys, all single babies, no twins. So no cheating, LOL, for the ones that might have had twins on this call today. I say that as a little bit of a joke, just to throw a bit of, I don't know, humour in with such a serious conversation here. So out of the 16 children, I'm the youngest, and the oldest is my sister, Pat Ockwell. So Sister Pat, for people that may know Sister, is an amazing senior elder who has made a lifelong commitment to her peoples and to her community. She turned 84 not last year, the year before, and for an Aboriginal woman to reach that age is a milestone. Well, they say the life expectancy gap between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal is about 12 to 15 years, and that's a huge gap for our people. And we do have a lot of sorry business in our Aboriginal families and communities. In my family alone, there's only 8 of us kids alive, and both my parents have now passed away. So that's an emptiness that I feel, and it lives with me now. So I just like to quote a little saying. It's actually comes under bullying, but I really like this, and I hope you can like this little, just a few words it is. Speak up even if your voice shakes. I reckon that's just hits the spot, that does, because even though I do this for a living, I still get nervous, and it's been years. My voice shakes. So I just thought, yeah, I'd add that in. So after all that we have been through and still are going through with the COVID pandemic and the crazy weather around all over the states and, you know, things that are happening in other countries, the wars and everything, it's just horrible. And I also think that climate change needs to be up top there with this conversation today. That's why we're having a lot of crazy weather, I think. The climate change, it's here, it's happening. So I do believe that Aboriginal people are the owners of Australia in all different mobs. And I would just like to share with you that we have never ceded our sovereignty, which is quite sad. And there has been no treaties with us up to date. But in Victoria, they are starting the First Peoples Assembly off, and hopefully for my future generations, they'll reap the benefits from that. So I think, I know I'm only on the 5 minutes, I could keep going on, but thank you so much for having me to do the welcome today for this very important event. And I might stay on and listen if that's okay. And thank you, everyone. Please take care and stay safe. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Auntie Georgina. And please do stay on. It's fabulous to have heard from you about the strong First Nations, Indigenous women that you've connected to and are connected to, and that concept of caring connections and community is so strong. And I love that quote you've used, speak up even if your voice shakes, out of nerves, anger, pain. It's important that we do that. So thank you so much for really giving us a good sense of you and really helping us to focus what we're talking about today.
Thank you.
A little bit of housekeeping for all of us. Because we are using Zoom, we suggest you use the speaker view in your settings. Questions and comments can be made via the chat function, and they will in fact be fed through to me when we get to the Q&A part of this session. You should know that we are recording this event. So there you go. There you'll see where the suggestions, how you can make yourself use the speaker view. We are recording this event. So if you don't want to be seen on camera, make sure you actually turn off your video. And you also, if there are any sensitivities, you might want to think about removing your name from the screen or changing the name on the screen. So that's just something to be mindful of as we're going along. We will be tweeting and streaming this event online, and we ask that you use these handles: hashtag Haag Home at Last, HAAG Home at Last, hashtag Everybody's Home, hashtag housing for safety, hashtag end ageism. That's when you're making your social media postings. And we are really, really keen for your input, but please do ensure that your contributions are respectful and constructive. Now, the issues today here can be confronting, can be distressing. As Auntie Georgina noted, this is a very big problem. So if you do need to, please seek out any support you might need. There's some numbers there. We're going to be putting them in the chat as well, but there's Lifeline, Beyond Blue, 1800 Respect, Q Life, etc. Now, we do have a really fantastic lineup of speakers today, some really inspiring women who are running as independents and in this election for lower house seats and the Senate. And in doing some research into the lineup, I have to say I was so impressed by the resumes of these speakers. These are not women who, they are so accomplished and done such interesting things. They're coming from the sporting world, academia and science, the arts, small business, high finance, the legal fraternity, marketing and education. We have an Olympian, a comic, a bakery owner, an investment executive, a marketing expert, a festival director, a former tradie lady tradie, and a marine rescue volunteer. And that's not the sum of who these women are. They are candidates with varied experiences and backgrounds coming from very different walks of life. But each and every one from the research I've done has been spurred on through their experiences to act, to right wrongs, to pursue justice. Today, they are here to advocate for gender equality and fairness in our housing market as they seek office to effect change. But before we get their thoughts, it's really important that we get an understanding of those women with lived experience and what they want out of this election.
We had a lovely home, and due to our business debts, we had to sell the home. We're now living in a rental property with our daughter.
I had a rather traumatic marriage breakup, which left me without a home and without any money.
For 3 years, I was homeless, which for an older woman means couch surfing, moving from place to place. I moved 18 times in those 3 years.
My problem is housing. I'm sick. I have this diabetes. I need to be near to shop, near to train station and bus.
Housing experience is very difficult in Queensland.
I've been a renter all my adult life. In the last few years, rents have gone up significantly.
There's a lot of maintenance that needs to be done, and the real estate just keeps ignoring my requests.
I've been to different places and they don't care about you.
I've been buying houses, alternating with renting houses. And I'm afraid the alternating has finished and I'm just going to be renting from now on. And I hope I've got enough money left over to eat.
Having a big mortgage, forced into early retirement through ill health and having no superannuation.
I lost my job in the last lockdown. I became unwell, just can't afford my rent.
Not being able to find affordable housing in private rental.
My journey was paved with trauma.
I know that there's a lot of people, women in particular, my age, who don't have the comfort of having secure housing.
I work with too many women, older women over 55, who are at risk of housing insecurity because there is nothing affordable and there is no social housing.
Something desperate is going on and needs to be fixed.
What I see the government doing for the elderly, whether gay, straight, bi or gay, transgender, is nothing.
I will vote for the party or candidate that will support,
recognise,
that has a commitment,
shows some initiative
about housing,
long-term housing,
safe housing,
affordable and safe accommodation,
particularly for older women
who don't have the security of their own home.
a national housing strategy, more social housing, targeted services to address homelessness for older women.
We shouldn't be having older women sleeping in their cars or at bus stops. It's just not right.
Housing is a basic human right.
Having seniors housed
in a forever home.
I will vote for change.
I vote for change.
I will vote for change.
Some really powerful stories there from ordinary women who have experienced firsthand what it's like to be worried about where they're going to live and how they're going to live. And that's really important context for the discussion that we're having today. These are all too common, these experiences, these are all too familiar. And it's great to see some very clear demands from those with lived experience. Now to our panelists. Each of you will be speaking for no more than 5 minutes, and I will interrupt, and then we'll be having our Q&A. Just to note that Jane Caro, who's running for the Senate in New South Wales, is also running a little bit late. She's delayed and will be joining us when she can. Our first candidate, our first speaker today is former Olympian, lawyer and the sitting independent member for the seat of Warringah in Sydney's North Shore is Zali Steggall. She's been the member since 2019. Zali, your 5 minutes starts now and welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Auntie Georgina, for that wonderful welcome to acknowledgement of country. And if I could also pay my respects and acknowledge the matriarchal line, which often does not get enough attention, and the incredible custodianship of our lands. I would also like to acknowledge Sarah Nelson, who I know is on board, who's a constituent here of mine in Warringah. And she has done incredible advocacy in relation to homelessness and with lived experience in these issues, and I really appreciate her input, and I see her around our streets often. But thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's such an important topic. The experience of homelessness by elder women is just unacceptable in our society when women have spent such a huge part in the caring side and nurturing and support side of our society. Thank you to Housing for the Aged Action Group for organising this important event by inviting me to speak. Again, we did in September last year. So according to the Australian Human Rights Commission, every night, roughly 1 in 200 Australians find themselves without a safe, secure or affordable place to sleep. And during COVID and now continuing, the costs of living, the increasing costs, community groups are telling me the demand for homelessness services on the Northern Beaches is still incredibly high. Recent reports from Bridging Housing show there's now been some 81 referrals since July 2021 and only 23 have been housed. So you can see that gap. And good news that there's a number of rough sleepers has nearly halved in the same period. But as we know, that is only one side of the problem. For older women over 55, the fastest growing cohort of people experiencing homelessness, and they're often the least likely to seek help and to speak up. And so that risk of slipping into homelessness is so much greater. Gender is a huge factor in this. We know the inequalities that women face more broadly are some of the inequalities pushing older women towards homelessness. 44% of single women over the age of 45 are now on low to medium incomes and don't own their homes and are renting and are often in insecure work on a casual basis. Likewise, 50% who are nearing retirement age have a super balance of $50,000 or less, whereas the same only goes for about 33% of men. So you see that difference straight away. A local woman in Warringah recently told me her story. It's a story of abuse, mental health issues, compounding with financial insecurity, and it all pushed her repeatedly into homelessness. We know that it's only through affordable and stable housing that it enables people to get back and regain stability in their life. And so it's so incredibly important that that is front and centre of policy. We need to be able to make sure that for many older women, financial inequality leads to that homelessness. And we know that for so many women, as they lead into retirement age with meagre savings, potentially to face homelessness again. So financial and housing stress is disproportionately affecting women, the gender pay gap, but also domestic violence consequences, domestic and caring duties undertaken by women, family separations. It all contributes to this problem. There are ways of addressing the problem. During COVID, we saw some temporary solutions, but which shows when there's a will, there's a way. We need to make those temporary solutions permanent. But we need to look at all levels of government, local government, state and federal, to change policies, create incentives for longer stable leases for older women, for example, more affordable housing, of course. We should establish a social and affordable housing future fund. The dividends from this fund would be invested as grants to increase social and affordable housing supply annually. Policies such as mandatory inclusionary zoning, where portions of all new housing is designated as affordable housing. That's been tried and shown to work. We look at the rental market and increasing the Commonwealth rent assistance and refine the eligibility criteria. We know more Australians are renting than ever before. Some 40% increase, I think the Grattan Institute said, in rent assistance would cost the government about $1.5 billion per year, but that would improve the ability of those receiving assistance to afford adequate housing, and in the longer term would increase the quantity and quality of affordable housing. We need incentives for landlords to offer long-term leases, especially to vulnerable groups such as women over 55. I think that should be considered to create multiple levels to solve this problem. At the end of the day, we also need to address the economic inequalities between genders. We know there's still a 14% pay gap and over 40% superannuation difference. I support that there would be, for example, we need 10 days domestic violence leave. We need to see superannuation on
Zali,
rental
your time
leave
is up.
and many other things. So too much to fit into such a short time, but thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. Second up is Liz Habermann, independent candidate for Grey in South Australia, a small business owner who runs the bakery in Woodner. And as a fellow South Australian, I can tell you how much bakeries are loved in South Australia. She's hoping to take on a mammoth job as the member for Grey, which covers about 92% of the state of South Australia. And that's an area larger than New South Wales. So Liz, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is a privilege to be a part of a panel that's, very highly regarded and esteemed. So, thank you. So, you said about Grey being 92% of SA. It's, that's over, 900,000 square kilometres. So you sort of take that in for a second. It's a mammoth job, and to get around to meet as many people as you can is no easy task. So, and I'll be on the road this afternoon to continue that. So just a quick, Grey covers, and I've got to read some of this because I've got so much going on in my head, includes outer metropolitan areas of Adelaide, a number of regional industrial cities such as Spencer Gulf cities of Boele, Port Pirie and Port Augusta, the whole Eyre Peninsula and Yorke Peninsulas, plus Clare and Adelaide Plains. Some of the most remote parts of Australia, including the APY lands, small, once bustling rural communities with few remaining services and often and unfortunately characterised as by some as dying. Quite a number of regional towns that services larger districts and the agricultural sector, and increasing mining and construction crews. And the coastal fringes, all of that, just like across most of Australia, and they've taken off. So unless older women have some decent support around them, it can be very challenging, regardless of where you live in the electorate of Grey. And it's not just older women, it affects all women, including those who work and have access to an income and who are younger, but impacted by lack of health and childcare. Childcare is a massive issue that we need to address as well. And that's got the flow-on effect to this as older women. So, training and career, general support opportunities, so many things need to be addressed. So for older women, the issues are just magnified tenfold. And it is mainly around access to financial and support resources. Challenges I'm hearing on the campaign trail that we also know too well from being engaged listeners to our communities include lack of available suitable accommodation options in larger district towns and regional cities. This is mainly for affordable, low maintenance unit-style accommodation, but is increasingly for beds in residential settings for women with high level support needs as well. Lack throughout Grey as well. We're without doctors in many, many places. So where they are available is generally in the larger regional cities, which are often several hours drive, which is another issue again for often older women. This means an individual's health issues are not identified and prioritised in a timely manner, which means that they can often manifest themselves very quickly to become more challenging. We've got a lack of family and community support, migration and drift of family, personal support networks to the larger regional cities and places like metropolitan Adelaide leave older women more susceptible to being isolated in their communities and prone to loneliness and mental and physical health challenges, and sheer distance between towns is, that's a factor as well. Older women who have lived in smaller communities for many years and whose partners has either died or for whatever reasons they have left each other and often left reluctant and guilty to leave those communities in which they have had long mental and physical attachment, as well as financially unable to do so without significant support from their families. Increasingly, there are no families or close friendships or a disconnect exacerbated by distance, poor communication, and the pressures on those important connections in keeping up with their own day-to-day life pressures. We've talked about the superannuation, the lower levels of super. I know personally, I've been the main child carer in our home for many years, and my super's nothing compared to my husband. So I know all too well, and it's a scary thought. What else? We've got women who are choosing to live in Grey, having downsized and where the cheaper accommodation sense of community is an attraction. Like anything with a silver lining, there is always a catch. Often these houses are in poor state of repair, are expensive to renovate, the lifestyle is expensive to sustain. There are limited support services or retail outlets available and need to have a car and a licence. And that's, the distance comes in once again.
Liz, that is your time. Thank you so much. Nice work. Thank you so much, Liz. A really important perspective there. Now we're going to hear from Hanabeth Luke, scientist and marine rescue volunteer and the independent candidate for the seat of Page in northern New South Wales. Now, for those of you who don't know the electorate of Page, it covers the towns of Casino, Evans Head, Grafton, Lismore and Sapphire Beach. You'll have heard a number of those place names in the news because they've been badly affected by flooding. The area is still in recovery mode, and we send a shout out to all of those who have been in those flood affected areas. So over to you, Hanabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. We're about to tip over to 12 o'clock. So look, I think the electorate of Page, where I've decided to run as an independent candidate, is a very large one. It's about 4 hours drive from one end to the other, and it covers many different communities. It's the 8th poorest electorate in Australia, and also has within it some of the poorest areas within New South Wales. Everything that I pretty much talk about now has to be punctuated before and after the flood, because what was a housing crisis is now turned a housing catastrophe. So before I was running, I was working in my role as a senior lecturer at the university, and do a lot of work with regenerative agriculture and meeting with people around the electorate just through my work. And I kept coming across people who were living in their cars, students at the university, an elder who I met through one of the community events, and I started to realise the extent to which our region was being left behind and the people were being left behind. Since I chose to run as the independent candidate, I've been meeting with people from the north to the south of Page, and a big part of that has been meeting with different community organisations, Momentum, Social Futures, and many more. So what I've learned from that there are extremely long waiting lists. People wait on the affordable housing lists for up to 15, 17 years. So you can literally grow old waiting for social housing. And for many people, there is a huge amount of red tape that prevents people from being able to get access to rent assistance and things like that. Overall, there has been a decline in social housing over the last 30 years. It's been steady, and it is worse within the regions. Across New South Wales, I think it's around 5% supply of social housing. It's 3.5% here. So there was a large federal investment in social. Well, a federal investment of, I think, $2.5 billion in affordable housing, social housing, a few years back. That what happened was there was a lot of developers in Sydney and in the cities that were ready to go with big projects. So those shovel-ready projects went straight where the funds went. So there was more in the city. So I guess that's one thing that happens there and that's how regions can get left behind. So what you have is a lot of people living in insecure accommodation, overcrowding, and it's hard to know the number of homeless because they're just really unseen. And living under bridges, sleeping on people's couches, it's hard to know. And there also that insecurity of housing and people, and that fear of being evicted, and they're scared of being vocal about issues with the house. So that all of those things have come together where people are living in motels for years and years at a time. Then the flood came, and now we have about 20,000 people who are displaced from their homes. And I was a part of the rescue. I was in horror going on a tinny past the flooded homes of my neighbours and friends. And the extent of this, you just cannot fathom without being here. Every time I drive through Woodburn, every time I drive through Lismore, just the extent and how deep and wide this has cut our people in the housing situation for people of all ages is really shocking. And so now we've got tens of thousands of people crowded into homes with very little plan. There's 93% of people haven't accessed funding support from post the floods. So there's this real lack of certainty. Mental health is at an all-time low. And the flood does have an uneven effect on women. The childcare centre where I sent my now 4-year-old flooded, and they have all the mothers of Woodburn and around and fathers, but they don't have anywhere to send their kids. So a lot of the mums by default can't work at the moment. So that's been a real impact as well. So what I'd love to see here is some certainty for the people of Page and that comes down to looking at, we need a national affordable housing strategy with some significant investment to bring our social housing rates back up. Not to 5%, but they should be sitting at more like 20, 30% as they once were. And there's some ideas from around the world that are really work well. They've got the London plan, so all new builds, 60% of houses have to be affordable in those new builds in London. And but I think it's important that they are distributed rather than put into one particular area.
I'm going to stop you there, Hanabeth, because that is your time, but I will. I really want to follow up on that international stuff because I think that's really important. So hold that thought. We will come to it. So thank you so much for that.
No worries.
Our next candidate is Fenella Edwards, who's running for the Senate in Tasmania. Fenella has had a remarkable life and work experience in the arts as a rapper, a puppeteer, a comic, a filmmaker. She's worked in tourism and hospitality and as a tradesperson. She brings a really unique perspective to this discussion. So Fenella, your 5 minutes starts now.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all gather all across Australia, to elders past, present and emerging, and thank Auntie Georgina for her welcome. And it's really exciting to be here today among so many independent, passionate women who can stand up and fight for change in this country. So hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. Now, this issue is particularly close to my heart because my own dear mother almost ended up homeless just last year. She spent her whole life in Tasmania. She worked as a nurse for 25 years. Then she got into medical repping. She even had a printing business. And she always loved and cared for my brothers and I greatly. And she was just a remarkable woman and did so much. And to be in that position, then, I mean, she divorced from my dad 20 years ago. They sold the house. Mum spent all the money she got from the settlement without purchasing a new property. She just tried to get to Melbourne. She's been living in Melbourne pretty much since the breakup. So it cost a lot of money for her to get there. And mental illness, she has developmental illness, which has also compacted her problems. But yeah, basically, she got evicted from her rental property, and my father and brothers don't really have much to do with her anymore because they don't know how to deal with her mental illness. And so it was all left up to me. And if I hadn't been in her life, my mum would be homeless now. And it was just thankful that there was actually a small break in the COVID travel restrictions. So I was able to get to Melbourne for 10 days and find her a place in a home. And it was only because she's been starting to get dementia, and she'd fronted up to a cafe a couple of days in a row without her keys or wallet, saying she'd been locked out of her house, and they referred her to the hospital. And the hospital ultimately gave me a referral to the place where she's currently living. But without that referral, I think my 10 days in Melbourne trying to move her out of a 2-bedroom property with all her stuff, and she was not in any fit state to do anything. Look for a property, apply for a property, move, anything. And I'm just so grateful for that travel bubble where I was able to go and set her up so she didn't end up homeless. And for me to see firsthand what an amazing woman my mother was, and to be in this position now is just truly heartbreaking. And it's a very common tale all across Australia, as we saw in the video. And I mean, if we have 405,000 women 45 plus facing homelessness, can we build 405,000 safe spaces for them to live? That's my first reaction. And I'm really excited to be here to learn on how we can fix this problem. And I hope that I do get the chance to be elected so I can be part of the solution. Yeah, that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fenella. That is really powerful, and I could certainly relate. And I imagine a lot of people on this call can relate to a lot of what you're saying. So thank you so much for sharing that. Our next speaker is Nicolette Bulla. She's running in the electorate of Bradfield in New South Wales, and that takes in northern Sydney, and is currently held by the Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher. Nicolette is in the world of investment and superannuation, and we certainly know that low levels of superannuation savings are a real issue for many older women. We certainly heard that from Liz earlier, and that of course exacerbates their risk for homelessness. So over to you, Nicolette, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm just going to put my alarm on. No, you'll tell me. Thank you. I wanted to first just lean into the raft of thank yous provided by Zali Steggall, and also to acknowledge Auntie Georgina and the traditional owners on the lands from which I'm beaming in Turramurra, which means Big Hill, as you mentioned, Sydney's Upper North Shore. So what am I hearing on the campaign about this? We had an intergenerational roundtable here in March, and I found that of the seniors, which comprise both men and women, that housing affordability and access or housing security was rated third of concern to our seniors after aged care and healthcare, which really surprised me. Climate change was equal third with housing security. And so I've moved, and why this is important to me is I've moved in and out of human rights throughout my career, and I've worked in sustainability strategy and non-financial audit with my brother's management consulting organisation. So I wanted to share a story about what I learned on a human rights impact assessment for a coal mining company operating in the Bowen Basin. when we looked at the impact of fly-in, fly-out workers to the community of Gladstone, and just wanted to share a bit about that experience and why it has impacted me and why I find it really important to look at this issue. So that's the impact of really well-paid transient workers who need sometimes accommodation on women and their families, who need affordable all-time accommodation. And the landlords can get like so much more for their rentals. And so they either put up the rent or they threaten to put up the rent. And when I met and listened to women, I learned that there were loads of them, like a really ridiculous proportion were had in some part of their last 10 years been couch surfing. Also women choosing different parks each night to park their cars with their youngsters, including with their pets as well. The women's in crisis, accommodation for women in crisis was completely full, but you couldn't access that if you had any teenage sons. So anybody over the age of 15 as a male child, you could not take them into a women's shelter. So that was cut out as an option. And then several women, 3 of them, in fact, who I spoke with, had just given up and were actually having sex with their landlords in order to provide secure shelter for their families. So I find this absolutely extraordinary gendered impact, I suppose, from either, and it gives me a little bit of rage, I have to say, and anger that we in 2022 have these types of things going on in our communities. And as Karen pointed out, there's 405,000 women Australia-wide over 45 who are on low incomes and don't own their own homes. That is just a homelessness tsunami waiting to happen. And as Hanabeth talked about the impacts of climate events that further stress what is already existing now for older women and others who need housing security. And that's why it matters to me. Does it happen in Bradfield up here on Sydney's North Shore? Almost certainly it does. It's difficult to get people to talk about that, of course, but from the 2016 data, there was 6% homelessness in Sydney's north. It's one of the fastest growing areas, so by 39% between 2011 and 2016. Now, of course, if you're homeless, you're probably not participating in the census data. So this is going to be very underrepresented compared to what's really happening on the ground. And I think so many other people have more eloquently pointed out the structural issues. So I'm going to go into my wheelhouses around finance. And as Zali mentioned, we've got 50% of women approaching retirement age, age 55 to 59, have a superannuation balance of less than $50,000. And that includes people with balances of $0. And that compares to only 33% of men at the same age. So when Keating brought in superannuation in 93 to shift that burden of savings from aged care onto employers and employees, so that the government right now with a smaller tax base could just have that safety net for those without means, it's created all sorts of unexpected consequences, a massive shift of wealth transfer from public to private, from all to some, and particularly from women to men, further exacerbating inequality. I'm not sure it was intended, but we need to look at this piece of legislation. It's an important part of our savings through a gendered lens. And that gap in superannuation balances at retirement between men and women is one of the increasing cumulative economic disadvantages faced by just the working women, let alone the ones that just don't get employed in the workforce.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Nicolette.
Already?
But, yes,
Okay.
already. But yes, again, hold that thought that the superannuation stuff is so important. So we can certainly pick that up in the Q&A. So thank you for that. And I have to say, I've been hearing speak up even if your voice shakes. I think almost everybody so far has been doing that. And I can see why. It's anger, it's pain, it's so many things. So thank you. We're now going to hear from Jo Dyer, independent candidate for Boothby in South Australia. The Boothby electorate covers the southern suburbs of Adelaide. Jo is a theatre director and until very recently was the director of the Adelaide Writers' Week. The stage is yours for the next 5 minutes, Jo.
Thank you, Karen. I'm joining today from the unceded land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their ongoing custodianship of country. It's been really inspiring actually hearing from my fellow independent candidates, because we've been beavering away in our little sections of the country. We haven't had many opportunities to come together like this. And like all of the independents stepping up this time, I'm running to actually try and represent the community and the community's interests rather than party political interests or sectional interests or corporate interests. And the community of Boothby encompasses people from a wide range of backgrounds living in very different areas. We run all the way from the coast down Glenelg and Brighton and Seacliff up through the plains. And in the suburbs of Adelaide, in Boothby, there's really wide demographic of wealth and of age. Some of Adelaide's poorest suburbs are in Boothby, and also some of Adelaide's most affluent. And then we keep going up into the Adelaide Hills, which similarly is more part of the affluent area of Adelaide. And the data on Boothby shows that overall we're very civically minded electorate. We care about our environment and we care about our fellow citizens. Many of us volunteer, but we are also an older electorate with an average age above the national mean, and with more residents engaging with the aged care system as package recipients, residents and workers. But housing affordability overall is often stated as one of the key issues for voters in the, as you can imagine, many recent surveys and polls conducted here in the third most marginal seat in the country. And that's both because of personal circumstances for citizens, but also anxiety about the next generation and what we're doing for our kids and our grandkids as home ownership slips away and out of reach for so many. And it's really the kind of topics covered by today's event and the equity and the social justice implications of the vital and essential work that is being done by organisations like the Older Women's Network and the Housing for the Aged Action Group. The work that you do every day, which is part of the reason that I decided to run for Parliament. It's because we are a rich country and there is no need for any of our fellow residents to be homeless or to live in poverty and to have to make those choices between food and bills and rent, and to be really driven to despair in the circumstances that we face today as you search for affordable housing. And this at the same time as investors are getting very rich of capital gains. These things only happen here in Australia because governments allow them to happen, because they are making choices about how to spend our money that abandons whole sections of the community while enriching others. And governments can make different choices. We saw that during the early COVID lockdowns when the federal government doubled the job seeker allowance and some of the other income support allowances overnight and removed those draconian and, to me, inexplicable administrative mutual obligation edicts for recipients as well. So thousands were lifted out of poverty and thousands more were found homes or provided with shelter, really at a keystroke. It was just shown to be that simple. And yet it wasn't done prior to the pandemic for the many caught on that sharp end of poverty or homelessness and living lives of ongoing and gnawing insecurity and distress. So there was this acceptance of the anxious, exhausting existence of the homeless and the apparently undeserving poor that was entirely accepted. And I just find this extraordinary in Australia. Being on the campaign trail, look, there's been so many fascinating things that I've learned and heard about. But I think probably the most telling was the groups and organisations and individuals who deal every day with the myriad levels of government bureaucracy and private providers, and whether that's through the NDIS or the aged care system or indeed the social security system. And I'm sure they weren't originally designed to be cruel, but they are now draconian and often punitive. And so all of these systems or services are underfunded. And I'm a big advocate for an immediate raising of the rate. And I can't understand why the Labor Party has walked back from its inquiry into that. But as well as the actual money going into the system, it's how the systems are set up and how challenging it can be to navigate through those systems, which is why I was so pleased to see that part of the Older Women's Network policy platform is about providing information in an accessible way, customised for the type of people who are needing to access the services, sometimes for the first time, and sometimes coming to those services with a sense of shame and being uncomfortable with silence. Have I already finished?
Yeah. No, it's terrific to hear you all really wanting to talk for much longer, but we will be able to pick up on some in the Q&A. So look, thank you so much, Jo. Now, Jane Caro, as I say, is still in transit and will join us when she can. And Zali Steggall is on a bit of a deadline as well. So I am actually going to put a couple of questions to Zali first. So Zali, in your kind of presentation, you talked about how this level of insecurity for older women is acceptable, yet, by doing nothing, but by doing it, sorry, it's unacceptable, but by doing nothing, our society seems to be accepting it. Why, for example, is homelessness more generally, and particularly of older women, not anywhere in this election campaign?
Well, maybe because we've got two men fighting it out for their egos and for power. I think for too often, actually, the debate is prioritised and I think hijacked on these really sideline issues, and we're ignoring the core things that really matter in this decade and that really impact people's lives. And I've seen too often the focus of the government to be very gender biased. It's very male dominated and it's not looking at these issues. So we know around homelessness, and especially for older women, it is a result of a number of policy failures, right? It's not like we can undo all those policies in one go. So we need to look at it we need a several pronged approach. We need to look at ensure we change policy so that we don't continue creating this problem, right? We need to fix pay gaps, workplace certainty, less casualisation of the workplace, more security for women as they're younger, and parental leave, childcare, all those issues, so we close the gender gap. And then we need now the rescue package for the older generations that are at the resulting end of policy failure for so long. So we need to put in place policies when it comes to more housing security, if it's rental or from a construction. And yes, we need to build more affordable housing, but it's just, we need to ensure housing that currently exists is made fit for purpose, but also that we maximise current existing stock. There are, I see in the chat group, there is some defence housing, there are levels of housing that aren't being used to maximum sort of potential. We need to create some incentives so that from a society we really look at it, and that's where I think it's looking at landlords, or maybe there can be a taxation aspect to create incentives for more affordable housing, for housing security for older women, looking at laws overseas around rental evictions for older women. It needs to be a suite of policy issues, and I would argue our current government just is not capable of looking at it in sort of the detail that it's required.
You've been in the seat of Warringah since 2019. What have you been able to do as an independent to advocate for these kinds of changes?
Yeah, look, I've met with the ministers regularly. I've asked the Prime Minister in question time, and I've received, I would say, often very unsatisfactory answers, especially when it comes to gender bias in sort of the budgets, for example, just trying to get a lens on impact of some measures and disproportionate support for male-dominated professions versus women's professions. COVID created an interesting situation in the sense that it exacerbated so many of our situations. We know domestic violence was worsened, called on so many non-for-profits and the charity sector for assistance. You saw a huge increase in support, job seeker, job keeper payments, and that alleviated certain aspects for some, and we finally had people above the poverty line in certain areas. If we go back to thinking the argument around New Start and that need for that to increase, and the COVID supplement finally put people actually at a level where they could afford their rent and living. Unfortunately, that's all been pulled back out, and so you get people back below the poverty line, and it's a snowball effect in terms of insecurity. So, and talking to charities here in Warringah, the increase in demand on their services has just been huge. You know, people going without food, the cost of living impacts are dire. And look, so from my point of view, the last budget, we saw $3 billion to our bottom line to do a 10 to 30, you know, the halving of the fuel excise measure. Now, keep in mind, a vast majority of people that will benefit from that measure are actually tradies for whom petrol is a tax-deductible expense for their business anyway, right? So such a better spend of that $3 billion would have been to target it to the more needy, those that are in vulnerable situations. We could have had, you know, if we're really talking about helping those in need, then we need to be a lot more targeted about it. And there aren't enough women around the table making the decisions, which is my conclusion. And that's why I'm so excited that we have so many strong, capable, smart and caring independent women running for Parliament, because I need a few more friends down in Canberra to ensure it's a louder voice and we stop and we change that climate in Canberra.
Thank you so much, Zali Steggall. It's I don't think it's a coincidence that most of the independents are right in that danger cohort, over 45 women. So thank you so much, Zali. Jane Caro has been able to join us, so I'm going to call on Jane right now to, she's a marketing expert. Sorry, I've gone and put the wrong screen here. She's a marketing expert, an advocate for public education who speaks up to the media regularly about gender issues as well as the plight of older women. She has signed up with the Reason Party in New South Wales to run for the Senate. Over to you, Jane. I think Jane is.
I think you're muted, Jane.
All right, we seem to be having some issues there. So what I might do is go on to just my next question. I wanted to ask Hanabeth in particular, you know, you're talking about the catastrophe in your area, 20,000 people displaced, you know, you're talking about that there's no plan, etc. One of the interesting things I came across in the research I was doing is that the University of New South Wales put research last year as in Page was in its top 20 lists of people who were under rental stress, 68%. I imagine that's off the charts right now. What do you think, given the scale of the problem where you are and threatening, you know, more floods, etc., what's the first step, a simple step where you might be able to see some great action or, you know, actual response? What's a first step you would like to see?
Oh, look, it's hard to limit it down to one thing because there's just so many different circumstances that people find themselves in right now. Like one of the things I didn't mention is, you know, that buying up and that in-migration to the region has caused housing prices to just skyrocket. And I've got, you know, this picture behind me of, this is just one whole street that's holiday lets in my little town of Evans Head, and where we've got half the people in Page on less than $500 a week, rent a family house in Casino, and our west is now $400 a week. So there's some huge issues there. But in terms of the flood, we need significant new builds. We do need that here. But I think they must, we've really got to rethink where we build. We have to. And that's got to be, those areas have got to be, if we're going to build on floodplains, if we're going to rebuild and fund people to stay where they want to stay, those places need to be resistant to flood, whether that's raising or other. There needs to be an update of the building codes and a real rethink about where we site people in a time of climate disruption. But one of the things that is just so important in all of this is mental health, actually. You know, when you're talking social housing, when you're talking affordable housing, those wraparound services that keep people well are so, so important. And we've got some of the highest rates of domestic violence in Page here in New South Wales. And there is no women's refuge in Casino, which has got a significant prevalence of it there. And so just making sure that we've got that safety net of mental health support and domestic violence support is really key. But we just need a huge investment in rebuild right now in Page. And I'm talking billions here. But we do also need to address that continual skyrocketing cost of buying a house. And like I could keep going on, but I think that's probably enough for now.
Thank you so much, Hanabeth. And Jane Caro is now on camera. So Jane, please take it away. You've got 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much. Our technical issues running from one place to another is a candidate's life, I guess. Look, homelessness is a huge issue for me ever since I wrote my book in 2018, Accidental Feminists, which really came out of me realising that the fastest growing group amongst the homeless was women over 55. Now, that's my generation. Those are my neighbours, my friends, the girls I went to school with. And it made me think about how we all looked at our future back in the 70s and what we expected from our lives. And so I wanted to investigate why that hadn't turned out, because my generation of women are a revolutionary generation of women. No one's really noticed because we're older and no one notices anything about older women, but I am an older woman, so I do. And why we're revolutionary is we're the first generation where the whole cohort, not just working class women, but the whole cohort, mostly worked for our own money for most of our lives. And yet somehow we've ended up the fastest group amongst the homeless, and also, particularly as we age, much so vulnerable to poverty, to housing stress, and to the very real possibility of having to live out of our car as we get into our late 50s and 60s. Really shocking statistics around that. Of course, older women are not the only people who are homeless. There are plenty of people facing housing stress at the moment. There are families who are being priced out of the rental market. There are young people who despair of the dream of ever owning their own home. There are all sorts of people who never expected to find themselves worrying about where they're going to live, how they're going to be secure. And this is because we basically walked away from our public housing and our social housing, which we used to provide. When I went to school in French's Forest in the 1960s, I used to walk through a great big housing commission area. That was all sold off in the 70s and 80s. And this is what we did. We followed the Thatcherite idea of, everyone should own their own home. Well, that works really well as long as prices of houses remain within reach of ordinary wage earners. But they have gone way past that. I was hearing up in Albury just last night about how they're trying to attract medical staff to the area, teachers to the schools, but they can't get them because they can't actually, those people are willing to come, but they can't find anywhere to live. They can't afford to live in the area because not only is it too expensive, but there are hardly any rental properties available. I mean, this is a crisis and it's snowballing into everything because we already have, as we know, a chronic shortage of teachers in schools all over Australia, but it is a particularly chronic problem in regional and rural areas. And if one of the blockages is that they can't actually find somewhere to live if they're prepared to go and teach in a country area, then that just makes it an impossible task. So we have to have a whole of government at every level looking at what we can do to solve our chronic and reaching crisis point housing situation. Certainly for people on fixed incomes, we know, for example, that 3/4 of women, I think it's about 3/4 of women over 70 who are living in private rentals, who are single women, that's divorced, widowed, or never married,
have we lost Jane again?
Are living in poverty now and terror in a tunnel. Can you hear me? And you can't see me. I mean,
that's good.
You can. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm in a tunnel. Sorry, this is crazy. I'm actually in a car, fortunately, only temporarily. Unlike an awful lot of people who are finding themselves as their home. I'll stop talking there because I've basically covered most of what I wanted to say. But I really think this is a crisis. And one of the things that saddens me so much when I travelled promoting Accidental Feminists, women would come up to me, older women, at the end of an event with tears in their eyes and very, very quietly tell me their story of facing housing stress. Because one of the awful things is people who face housing stress, families who have food banks and are worried about paying the rent and the utilities are ashamed. They see it as their fault. It's not their fault. It's our fault. We haven't thought ahead. We haven't planned. We haven't thought about people who are getting left behind. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to stand for the Senate, because I want to think about them. I can't forget those women who talked to me with tears in their eyes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to go to Fenella Edwards in Tasmania again. We had Hanabeth talking about the beach rentals, and from my research, certainly in Hobart, it's been impacted by the Airbnb effect, the mainlanders coming down, etc. So tell us a little bit about how do you see you might be able to overcome that? Are you able to articulate a little about how to free up housing, or any kind of policies you might like to see affecting areas like Tasmania in the way it has in recent years?
Yeah, well, I think Airbnb has had a big impact on housing availability, where there are more people looking for houses than there are rental properties. I actually moved from Hobart to Launceston 4 years ago because of the rental crisis in Hobart. I'm renting, and I basically couldn't afford to find a place because I had a cat and a bunch of stuff, and I just couldn't find anywhere except in Launceston. So I've been in this place for 4 years now, and I've got a really great rental, and I'm really lucky. But there's just more and more homeless people on the streets down here in Tassie. I was speaking to someone on the election trail, and he was a self-funded retiree who'd put all his money into an Airbnb investment. And so he was concerned about my saying, we need to crack down on Airbnbs, because, well, this self-funded retiree, that was all their money was invested in this one property. So I think considering things like that is going to be important too. But there definitely needs to be a crackdown on multiple property ownerships and vacant properties. And I think too, there's also a lot of government housing in disrepair that it's just sitting there unused. So I think having a strategy to fix up all government housing that's being unused and make sure it's used would be a really good thing to follow.
Thank you, Fanella. I want to go to you, Joe. You talked in your speech about, the anxiety that homeowners have about their children. One of the big issues we're seeing at the moment is this desire by some people just to pass on their wealth. So they're either locking up assets or locking up homes or whatever it might be. You also made reference to negative gearing. I found it interesting in the research I was doing that it was very hard to find the words negative gearing or capital gains tax in some of the websites of you all, because it's so toxic to talk about those two words. We know they're distorting the market, yet we don't want to actually say the words. Joe Dyer, that was one thing I could not find on your website, but I was pleased to see you. It could have been just where I was looking at it. I'm not accusing, but, what do we need to do about these, and why can't we talk about it with a straight face and be upfront about it?
You're right, actually. I think I used the words distortions in the market, or taxation distortions in the market. And I think that I'm not afraid to use those words. I think we do need to phase out negative gearing. And I would be happy to see some kind of grandfather clause for people who've invested under certain expectations. But the idea that we can treat property and people's homes as just another asset, I think, is misplaced. And I would say that both in terms of what it does to housing prices, but also, I think it was interesting picking up on Zali's phrase about a rescue kind of package. And in so many areas of social need, there's both looking for the medium to long term, and then there's the emergency rescue package, which is required right now. And that's the case, I think, in housing as much as it is in domestic violence, as much as it is in so many of our different social services, as a result of the neglect, really, from which they've been, or which they've suffered for so long. But if we then, I think, removing some of these tax distortions, both in terms of the capital gains discount and certainly negative gearing, I think is very important, so that we don't just inflate prices for investors and look after that side of the market. I also think we do need to acknowledge that housing could be out of reach for people, and look very much at the rental conditions. I mean, because so much of our kind of myths and our narratives and our stories are about the dream of home ownership and the great Australian dream, the fact that many people have never participated in the housing market as owners is sort of discounted, and we don't have strong renters' rights. So people are at the whim of their landlords, whether it not is because whether that landlords think that they can get better prices, or as we just heard from Fenella, it's things like not being allowed to have pets in your own home. So I'm also an advocate for kind of looking at longer term leases so that there is security of tenure for people who really are not. I mean, I work in the arts. Most of my colleagues, the actual, artists, the original gigging workers, never going to be able to afford their own home. I rent as well. And, I'm as a producer, I often have a full-time job, unlike the artists themselves. So I do think that, there's lots of, and that's what's so great about having a forum like this, is that it actually acknowledges the complexity of this issue across all of our lifetimes, and the fact that from the very beginning of when we enter the workforce and we have a gendered pay gap, and we have time out of the workforce and what that does to our super, all of these things lead inexorably up to then the conditions that Jane talked about so eloquently. So, as I say, we need to really be strategic and for the medium to long term, and that does mean stripping out some of those investor rights and financial windfalls, but we also need to look at the crisis which we are confronting now. So, there's just a myriad of different approaches policy approaches that your organisation has outlined so well, but we're not doing them. We just don't do them. And that comes to Zali's point, like the government's not inclined, they don't get it. We could just get on with this and start making some really swift and immediate improvements in the circumstances of many people.
Thank you so much. Liz, I want to come to you. Given what you've been talking about with all of the access issues to not just housing support, but all manner, whether it's health, education, etc., in some of the parts of remote and regional South Australia that Grey covers. When you look at the policies on offer from the major parties, whether it's Labor's Help to Buy or the LNP's various versions of the Home Guarantee Scheme, even the Greens, Build a Million Homes, will any of these be practical, be applicable, will work in a place like Grey?
I think places like the bigger areas like Boele and Port Augusta, possibly, but we're talking, a massive area, like it's most of South Australia. And there's other things that we need to address alongside of it as well. And so, I'm so fortunate. We're paying it off, but a roof over my head, like I'm absolutely fortunate. And mind you, this house was like $200,000. So I probably wouldn't even buy a car park where you guys are. So, I acknowledge that I'm okay. I've got 30,000 in super. My husband's got, 5 times that amount because, I've been looking after kids. So there's so many other areas that we need to be looking at across the board. Okay, I live in a cheaper home in the middle of Eyre Peninsula in South Australia. So I get it, it's a lot cheaper, obviously, easier to get a deposit together, but we don't have a doctor here. We've got a hospital, great staff, but, so while, there's places available that are cheaper, you miss out on so many other things. So I just want to also sort of go back to the childcare thing. So the confidence that women can get from working, but they can't work if there's no childcare. So, they go through, I've got staff in my bakery and they don't feel, because they've been at home looking after kids because there hasn't been childcare, they've got to, I've got one who's 67 and still working because she needs to. And she should be able to spend time with the grandkids and stuff. But it's just, there's so much work to be done and no one's bloody well listening. And it's like, that's what it makes us so frustrated. And I'm getting to that age group that it sort of hits home. You think, well, thank God I've got a roof over my head. It's, everyone's a few months, if you, don't cover your mortgage, you can face that too. But I'm okay, I'm fortunate. But kind of hits home when people are or choosing, well, needing to live in a caravan because they can get a site for $25 a night, let alone the cars that live in. I mean, Lincoln is supposedly a rich farming, a rich fishing city-ish, and yet there's, I think on one particular night there's 100 people sleeping rough. Of that, I don't know what the amount is for women, but I've seen women in their cars down there, and it's like, it's this sort of, it's this hidden, no one wants to talk about it, no one's addressing it. There's a developer in Lincoln who is actually currently doing a development for disability people so that they can go and stay in his accommodation that's disability. It sort of opens that up for them. Had to fight council to be able to do that. And his next project, he wants to work on affordable housing to get women, particularly women, older women, into their own homes that are sort of, that can be their own, but don't cost the earth. And so, but he's blocked all the time by council because it's like, oh no, they're just not addressing it. And it needs to be all levels of government. Everyone needs to work together and like so urgent. Like we just, how bad?
I will interrupt you there, Liz, because I actually want to take this to Jane Caro, that whole development side of things. One of the kind of unspoken things in our society is how corrupt the whole building, construction, rental, landlords, development, land release. It's an entirely, from top to bottom, it's corrupt. What do you see might be a simple answer to try and alleviate some of that, whether it's kickbacks for land development, developers not doing what they say they're going to do? What is there one thing that could be done to kick off some real reform in that area?
Well, I certainly think there should be some much firmer legislation, which maybe councils have to adhere to as well, about what happens when someone applies to develop something in their community. I know that the late, great Susan Ryan had some very good ideas in this area of saying to developers, for example, if you want to develop a project in a particular area, you have to put X percentage of the accommodation, say it's 20 units, 4 of them have to be for public housing. If the developer's not prepared to do that, they have to give the equivalent amount of money to the council, who then builds the 4 pieces of accommodation. There's a number of good things about that idea. First of all, it avoids ghettos. It avoids putting social housing all in one place, and then there's stigmatisation that goes with that. And we all saw what happened to the big high-rises in the 70s and the housing commissions and that sort of thing. So if you, in fact, make it part of every development that there has to be a percentage of it that is social housing, I think that could go a long way towards, making developers, have to think more about the effect their development is having on the community they're entering, rather than simply how much money can they make out of it. And it would also benefit the community rather than just take away from them. But the problem also is that we get a lot of not in my backyardism. So even when people want to develop social housing, public housing, and alleviate this crisis, there are so often objections. We've also seen this, for example, to group homes and very good initiatives in aged care where they want to build in a particular community, and the community is, in a way, the fear is often whipped up by those who'd like to use that land for something else or believe it to be very profitable. One of the problems we've done is we've created a society where, for the lucky group, a lot of their wealth is tied up in their house. It is tied up in the value of their land and property. And so they fight furiously to hang on to that. And that, I think, is the political barrier we face all the time.
I want to go to Nicolette Bulla, because you're in one of the ritziest, you've got some of the most expensive housing in the country. You've told us some, pretty compelling stories about what some women are going through. I'm just going to have a look. The University of Sydney had a report where 40% of households in Bradfield are under mortgage stress. The University of New South Wales has research that says 38% of investors are feeling the squeeze in your electorate. So it's not working for anybody, it would seem. What do you see, What do people understand in your electorate, for example, about this issue more generally for women and how vulnerable it is? Do you actually have to convince them that it's a problem?
There's a lot of people, as I mentioned, the seniors, but also the young people who have almost given up on the idea that they're going to be able to afford a house here. People like me and the sort of sandwich generation laugh about how our kids are never ever going to leave home. And in fact, we're probably just going to live in multi-generational homes, and that's the way it's going to be. A lot of the young people are very cranky too about obviously paying. They come out with their HECS debts, or if their TAFE is a little bit more affordable than university, but who knows, right? They just can't even imagine they're going to enter the market. So you're actually, unless you already have intergenerational wealth, there is almost no chance that you can break that cycle. And Indigenous Australians see this all the time. There's absolutely no opportunity for them to move through that poverty cycle because the whole system is stacked against them. And that's why I keep harping on about the importance of taking that gender lens back onto investment decisions. And I'm going to be just a bit bold here and talk about the non-women things that I see the coalition government really proudly celebrating, things like spending money on submarines, fossil fuel miners and whiskey bars. And yet, and whilst I welcome, for example, that superannuation guarantee being removed so that if you earn $450 per month or less, you can also now be paid superannuation. That's really helpful for those low paid part-time workers, which tends to be a lot of the women. But that's about $45 a month at 10% or $540 a year. I just want to show in comparison, the government announced in the same week initiatives for super savers, particularly those further tax deductions for already well-off superannuants. And depending on your existing super balance, those people will be enjoying between $10,000 and $110,000 extra in their super in one financial year from that tax move. So 540 versus anything between 10,000 and 110,000. So it's not just about lifting women up, it's about the decisions get made across the system, which just don't work to close the gap. It's got to work both ways.
We've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to put a question to each of you, and I want the briefest of answers. And it's about the fact that we focus on housing affordability, but really in the context of home ownership and getting into the market, etc. So I'm going to ask each of you, and I want something really succinct and quick if you can. What is it going to take to effect a shift in thinking in Australia from talking about housing as a market and as taking it to something that should be a human right, where political whims, election promises, market fluctuations don't matter? I'm going to go to you first, Zali Steggall, if you are still there. And quick.
Trying to multitask. I'm sorry, I've just got a few urgent things. Look, I agree. I very much agree with some of the comments Joe made, is that Australia does have an obsession with home ownership, which is quite interesting. I spent many years in Europe, and it's not the same in Europe, but it's a much stronger focus on rental rights. And I think that is a big part of where we're at. And we do need to acknowledge that. There needs to be better investment from an infrastructure point of view and better planning. We have, the idea.
I'm going to cut you off there. We need to be quicker. Liz Habermann, what do you think it's going to take to shift from talking about market to human rights, a right for housing?
Well, I think, that's a tough one to make very short comment on, but maybe we don't have to reinvent the wheel either. Maybe we do need to look overseas and see what other places are doing to make it not about, oh man, I've got to own this house. And make it not, we've got to think outside the box and not just, you've got to get a 20% deposit or something. There's so many different, I don't know.
Thank you. No, I understand. I put you all on the spot. This was a question without notice and a bit rude of me. Fenella, what do you think needs to happen? Indigenous women in particular have huge barriers.
Yes. Well, I think what we need to do is elect more women who don't need empathy training. It's built in naturally to us. And men have been running the country for too long. So we need to vote below the line, vote for independence, vote for passionate women like the ones you see here on your screen. And Zali's just disappeared, but I hope she gets re-elected. And I really would love to work with all of you in Parliament on this issue and others.
Great, thank you so much. Joe Dyer, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I agree with Fenella. I think we just need to change the type of people that we elect, because I think on this issue, actually, as on so many issues, particularly social issues, is that the people are ahead of the current leadership. I don't know that there is too much of a need to change the mindset of the Australian communities, because they are living these issues every day, and the majority of people are, whether they are paying off mortgages or they're renting or they're trying to find property in which to live. So I do think that we know the solutions that we have, and there's a really comprehensive kind of blueprint laid out by both the Older Women's Network and older. I've forgotten the.
It's all good.
Acronym, but
yeah, fantastic. Hanabeth,
but that's the thing. You've got
think?
the solutions, and so as in so many places, when the experts come together and they look at things from a social justice perspective, starting out as with a human rights basis, the solutions flow easily. We're just not implementing them. So let's get on with that.
Thank you, Hanabeth.
What's happened here in Page is unprecedentedly shocking in terms of its impact on housing for people of all ages and genders. And it has had an uneven impact on women, as it often does. This is an opportunity, and how Australia responds to what's happened in Page could be an opportunity to have a better blueprint for the future. What we've had here is an example of what happens when climate disruption hits our shores, and what can happen when so many thousands of people are displaced from housing. It also highlights the issues we already had, but there's no one, as I said, one-stop approach, but there's an opportunity here in the many ways that we address this, and significant funding and care in how we treat the people in this recovery that we can take across Australia and into the future, particularly if we elect more women who care about these issues.
Brilliant. Thank you. Nicolette.
Trying to find a point of difference, because I completely agree. I would say, yes, if we put people at the centre of policy decision making, actual people who are stakeholders to the decisions that are made, we're going to get better outcomes. Aggressive collaboration, which I know that women do on the large better than our male counterparts, and some extra diversity gender-wise in there too, please. But I also think it would be a very interesting experiment to put some people who are very experienced in superannuation, particularly industry super funds, who have to take a long-term view, who have one stakeholder, their members who need to retire with dignity and safety and security, into those policy decisions. I'd love to see what they come up with.
Thank you so much, Nicolette. Jane Caro, quickly. You're on mute.
More people in power, obviously, more women in power, rather, more people, more women in power, and more people who are engaged in social justice. But I actually am not all that bothered about changing the mindset. I believe strongly that if you change the behaviour, the mindset follows, much more than the other way around. So actually what we need to do is start putting in place policies and actions that will make a difference to the availability of housing, not just the affordability, the access and the availability. The other thing, which is weird, and I hate to say it, but in a way the crisis of climate change is going to concentrate our legislators' minds on this, because so many people are going to be impacted and they're going to have houses that are uninsurable anyway, which is going to make us think differently about housing.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you all of you. Huge thanks. It's such an important conversation, so many different great perspectives. Now, we have taken note of what you've said, and we're going to look forward to following your progress in acting to end homelessness for women. And we wish you all the very best of luck for the remainder of the campaign. We also do want to continue to work with us in holding the major parties to account after May 21st. So look, we have some specific asks. We are demanding more housing as part of a comprehensive national strategy, more support, particularly in raising income support payments, policies to address the systemic gender inequality that is really holding women back. And for more specifics on what HUG and OWN are asking, please go to the website oldertenants.org.au//election 2022. There's lots of great information, infographics and the like on what's needed to address the critical issue that we've been talking about today. And we really want all of you who've been watching and taking part today to leave prepared to talk about this issue to your family, your friends, your colleagues, and your local candidates. Please also share the HUG and OWN posts on your social media platforms or via email, or however it is you like to alert others to the things that matter to you. When we get this conversation going on a really wide scale, that's when we're going to get some real action. So, and remember, through your vote, you can make this happen. So goodbye and thank you to everybody, and particularly to the Older Women's Network and to HUG for putting this on. It's such an important debate, and I think we've all really learned a lot today.
Bye.